Hello and welcome to another episode of Global Tantrum. Should we call this an emergency episode? I don't know. Are we in an emergency? With me, as always, is my co-host, Galen Jackson of Williams College. With me, increasingly, as always, but increasingly, is Ryan Weldzius as well. Welcome back, Ryan, of Villanova University.
Having me, friend of the show.
Ryan, we need help. We need help figuring out what's going on. Last we talked, we were talking about tariffs. Liberation Day has come and gone. Do you guys feel liberated?
My retirement accounts feel liberated.
Crap, I was going to make that joke.
My bad.
Yeah, I think the entire world is feeling a little bit liberated at the moment. Starting with us in the US, but
Yes.
proceeding to China, over to, what was it, the Solomon Islands? Yeah, the Penguin Islands in the South Pacific, where nobody lives, the Europeans, of course, even the Israelis. Yeah, we've got a lot to talk about today, but let's just start with a temperature check. And I'm going to ask you this simple question. Are the Liberation Day tariffs a negotiating ploy? Meaning, do you expect them to come down as countries try to make concessions to President Trump? Or are they in it for the long haul? Meaning, is he trying to produce structural change with this shit? Ryan, what's your opinion on this?
It's hard to know for sure because we don't actually know what the end goal is. So the administration hasn't been very clear on what they want. When they imposed tariffs on Mexico and Canada a couple of months ago, they said, we're trying to bring down fentanyl smuggling into the US, and we want you to also deal with a migration crisis at its borders. When he put tariffs on China in 2017, it was for similar reasons, not for fentanyl per se, but he was interested in reducing the bilateral trade deficit with China, but also trying to get some protections for US businesses, US firms in terms of IP. And so there was a very clear goal with these trading partners. This time around, it's not clear, and the administration has provided even less certainty in what they're trying to do. So you have some members of the administration saying that this is a negotiating tactic, for instance, the president. And then you have the rest of his team saying that, no, there will not be negotiations, and insinuating that this is going to be a major change in the global international order. So what it's going to be, I have no idea. We know from everything we followed about Trump since we learned about Trump watching Home Alone 2 as kids. Trump cares about transactions, right? He's a transactional person. He wants to make deals.
He wants to show you where the bathroom is in his building.
And he's great at showing you where the bathroom is. In terms of deal making, people have different opinions on that. My opinion in terms of him making trade deals is he's not great. We talked about this last time. The USMCA is just a repackaging of the TPP, which was negotiated in the prior administration, just losing market access to 9 other Pacific Rim countries, right? So we got the same thing from Mexico and Canada, except we lost access to other markets. So is that a good deal? No. With the US-China trade war, he put in place all these tariffs. We ended up paying billions and billions of taxpayers to farmers who lost out from the export of their goods to China. And what we got in for all this was a phase 1 trade deal that really had no rules, no mechanisms to stop China from certain practices, no mechanisms to stop the US from certain practices. It was just like the facade of an agreement, but it wasn't an agreement. Also, any major agreement has to be approved by Congress. And this was done in a way that it was just a executive level thing. So there was nothing in place to really stop it. So Trump's record on making trade deals is really bad. And so if he is trying to make bilateral trade deals, one, it's going to take a lot of manpower, which the government doesn't have because they've been trying to slim down the federal government. And two, it's going to take clear objectives. And I don't think we know what those objectives are.
So
Okay.
I want to follow up on that a little bit. I mean, first, can you speak a little bit to just how significant the tariffs that have been announced are in a historical perspective? I've
Mm.
Other than rewatching Ferris Bueller's Day Off, I haven't heard much about Smoot Hawley since like ninth grade, but that's getting invoked quite a bit these days. And second, I mean, I take your point that this doesn't make much sense to you, but if you were going to try to ascribe some strategic logic to what the White House is doing, what would you come up with?
Great questions. All right. Historically, I turned to Doug Irwin for this. He's an economic historian at Dartmouth, your neighbor, Galen.
Oh,
He
wow.
was recently on a great podcast called Trade Talks with Chad Bown at the Peterson Institute in DC. And he's been studying the history of U.S. trade for the last 200 years. And what he talked about with the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, which people who study international political economy, people who study just general international relations, people who study U.S. history, or as you said, watch Ferris Bueller's Day Off, know this was a major increase in the average tariff rate in the U.S. The major difference is at the time, the average tariff rate in the US was about 36%. We're still a pretty protectionist country before World War II. The Smoot-Hawley tariffs raised that about 6 percentage points to about 42%. So still a huge increase. And we talk about this, at least prior to Wednesday, as when I teach my international political economy class, we talk about this as the biggest increase in tariffs that we know in modern history and the impact this had on the Great Depression. Right, October 1929 is the beginning of a recession. We don't go into a depression really until you have these trade wars and currency wars between all the major economies following the 1931 Smoot-Hawley tariffs. Right, so it brings us from what looks like a protracted recession into a very clear depression. Now we're at a time where the U.S. tariff rate, average tariff rate on most countries is close to zero. Right, we have high tariffs on certain goods. For instance, pickup trucks. We export a lot of pickup trucks. We don't import a lot. So we have a high tariff rate on those to protect that market. Now we're increasing that low rate of about, let's just say 0% to over 20% in most cases. In some places, closer to 30%. All right. So we increased in 1931 from 36% to 42%. Now we're increasing over 20% on a lot of countries and on most goods. That is the biggest tax raise that this country has, I think, ever seen. I haven't checked with tax scholars, but it looks like this is the biggest tax increase that the US has ever seen. So the impact, we don't have a historical analog for this that we can use to kind of think through this. This has never happened before. And so we can use a Smoot-Hawley to get a general idea. And we know that the end result wasn't good. We're also at that point already in a recession. We're not there yet, but it doesn't look promising. Then if I was to think, okay, these are the best minds working in the executive branch. Let's say that Peter Navarro is a future winner of the Nobel Prize in economics. We'll come back to Peter Navarro. If there was what is a strategic outcome? So if we think that they're trying to rebuild the international order, and we kind of talked about this last time with cooperation, if that is the end goal, you need countries with the willingness to negotiate and cooperate with the U.S. But you also need the U.S. having willingness to cooperate with them, or else why would any country give anything to the U.S.? And it doesn't seem like the Trump administration has any desire to engage in that sort of cooperation. Making bilateral deals, sure. He likes to be known as the deal person and get these deals and to talk about it. But restructuring the global international order, I don't think that is going to happen in this administration. Now, the next administration, let's say that we have a change. Let's say that we go into a prolonged recession. there is a change in the executive in 2028, can we see that there is going to be a major change? Again, I'm not sure, because on the Democratic side, I don't see a generational change leader currently stepping up. I think Cory Booker's 25-hour speech was impressive. But is Cory Booker a Barack Obama type leader? I'm not sure. And so I don't know what's going to happen after this administration. What I do think is going to happen in terms of domestic policy is I could see Congress begin to take back a lot of the power that they've given to the executive over the years. So something that I know that you guys have talked about in terms of international relations, but in terms of economics, there's been a lot of power given to the presidency to negotiate tariffs on one account. Trump doesn't have that right now. He doesn't have the trade promotion authority that Congress usually gives to a president to engage in negotiations on tariffs. So that's one issue, right there.
Wait a second. He doesn't?
So he has emergency powers. The IEA, the International Emergency Economic Act, I think that's it, IEEA, is what he's using. This was passed in, I think it was 1976 or 77 under Carter.
Yeah.
And this gives the president the power to deal with the economy as he or she sees fit during an economic emergency. Now, it's not clear what that economic emergency is, given that when Trump came into office, unemployment was at about 4.1%. This is historically low. Inflation was lower than most. I think all developed economies, all the rich economies had higher inflation. So that was coming down. I think it was still at about 2.8%. Projected growth in the US was high for the next year, for the foreseeable future. So we definitely were not in an economic crisis, but he's using that as the legal foundation for him to be able to put in place these tariffs. Congress has the ability to take those powers back.
Right.
I don't think that that's going to happen with this Congress for sure. And even if the Democrats win back the House in 2026, it doesn't look like they win back the Senate. Even then, they need to have a really strong majority or some buy-in from Republicans, not just the four that signed on to the proposed bill to get rid of the tariffs on Canada. You're going to need a lot more buy-in from Republicans. And I'm not sure if it's going to be there because Trump really, really has them by the
no way
neck.
It's the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of October 1977 for people.
Thank you.
Very close
IEPA,
attention.
That's right. There was a P in there. Thank you.
What's interesting is there was no international economic emergency. He has invoked or created one. So I wonder if that's strictly legal.
Yeah, I'm just going to keep lobbing these at you, man. Like,
no. Wait, Galen. I want to know what you think.
Me too.
In terms of, I just want to quickly summarize, I think, what Ryan said, which is truly seems unprecedented, which is a word that gets thrown around a lot, but
especially when Trump is president. Yeah.
Yeah. But just the figures Ryan cited in terms of tariff hikes, as opposed to stuff that happened in the 30s, this seems considerably larger in terms of the delta, and given the context in which the decisions were made, seems much larger and much more impactful potentially. The second thing is, like, it seems like the US is going to be a big loser here. I mean, maybe,
that's for sure.
I guess we'll find out. And the last thing is, in terms of strategic logic, I'm not sure there's much beyond Trump has a weird fascination with William McKinley, and I'm not sure I can point to more beyond that. In terms of what I think, it seems like a self-inflicted wound that I'm sort of struggling to make sense of at this point. I don't know either whether this is a negotiating ploy or, I mean, it was sold during the campaign much more as like, we are going to be bringing manufacturing back to the United States.
Correct. That's right.
And we talked about this last time. dissatisfaction with the so-called neoliberal order and the winners and losers from trade. And Ryan nicely laid out why this would not be the way to correct some of those failures and that there were better policy levers out there if that was your goal. But now I'm hearing much more from the White House, a mixed bag in terms of, yes, it's about bringing manufacturing back, but it's actually about negotiating leverage. I'm just kind of lifting what Ryan said at this point, but like, if it is indeed a negotiating ploy, and this is about his art of the deal approach, it seems like given how upset the rest of the world is, including countries that have largely been friendly to the United States, it has actually put the US in a worse negotiating spot. This is going to be another question I ask Ryan, but whether this just leads countries to look elsewhere from the United States going forward.
Yeah.
And even if it does increase US leverage somewhat, given the centrality of the US economy within the international system, is this a level of pain that Americans are going to tolerate prior to there being serious political ramifications? And even though he doesn't face re-election, is that a political situation that Trump's going to be able to ride out longer than the rest of the world? Particularly since, we've seen the reaction in Canada. They're in a fighting mood, but they're saying like elbows up or whatever.
Yes.
They can draw on a sense of nationalism to sustain a level of national cohesion that I'm not sure exists in the United States. So at a political level, I'm not sure, one, what the goal is, but even if it is some increased bargaining leverage, if that's actually going to work. But
Yeah. So as far as the level of economic pain and I suppose attendant political pain domestically, I was reading that these tariffs are estimated to cost the average American family around $4,000
that's a
going
lot.
forward. Yeah, and lost purchasing power. Now, the median income, household income in the United States is around $80,000, and that's pre-tax. So pre-tax, you're looking about a 5% haircut. Post-tax, maybe 8 to 9%. Significant, guys. Significant.
Massive.
Yeah, extremely serious, right? And we
And
face go ahead.
I was going to say, and we know how price increases affect domestic politics. We just lived through it.
Yes.
Whether you think that Joe Biden's economic plans during the recovery from COVID or to get the recovery going, whether you think or not that that led to inflation, Biden still took the hit and the Democrats took the hit for that inflation. Now, can we imagine that the entire Republican voting base is going to turn against Trump? Probably not. So far, we've seen that those who voted for Trump most recently in the last election, but had voted perhaps for Biden prior to that, their approval ratings of Trump have plummeted.
Big time.
Importantly, on the economy, we see the MAGA voters, those who have voted for Trump in the last 3 times he's run, they are still flatlined. They support him no matter what. That's not a huge part of the Republican Party, right? It's not what wins elections. It may win primaries, but it's not going to win elections, right? You need a stronger coalition than just that base.
That constituency is 15 to 25% of the electorate, is my understanding.
Mm-hmm. So primaries, we're probably going to see, unfortunately, a lot of pretty far right MAGA leaning people still winning in Republican districts and then getting to the House. Those firebrands are still going to be around. They're not going to lose because of the way that redistricting works in the US. It's going to happen. But for national elections, this is a major issue for Republicans. And I think Republicans now are seeing that this would be a generational shift in their party. Like, how do they get out of this? This is a party of limited government. That's gone. This is a party of cutting taxes. This is the biggest tax hike that we've seen. this is a party that used to be a free trade. They shifted that, but it's also a party now of blue collar workers. Blue collar workers are going to get screwed by this, right? This is going to lead to a recession, which leads to we're going to have higher prices. We're going to have unemployment. You're going to have less investment from a lot of these companies that are producing in the U.S. It's just not good for a lot of the things that Republicans say they're for. What we will see, I think, I put it like 80% odds that we will see that tax cut bill go through. So
Okay.
normally when you are in a recession, it makes sense to cut taxes because that's going to boost your economy. In 2017, I was shocked that Republicans were pushing this through. This was their main piece of legislation in Trump's first 2 years. I was shocked they were doing it because the economy was chugging along. It's like, it's 9 o'clock in the morning, you've been partying all night, you want to go home, and someone's like, here's a line of Coke. That's not what you need. You got to go home and sleep. And that's what they did. They got the economy moving really, really, like they got it moving again, which they didn't need to do. It was already chugging along. And so at that point in time, I remember saying to my friends, we're going to see a recession again in the next 2 years. It's got to happen. There's just way too much going on in the economy. And this is going to come back and bite them in the butt. I think that now it's almost certain that they're going to pass and extend this tax cut, which I think might also be political poison for the Republicans, right? A high tax increase on workers through the things that they're buying, and then a huge tax elongation of these tax cuts for really wealthy people. So if Democrats are smart and they're able to show that this is what's happening, I think it's going to be potentially poison for the Republicans if they get this passed before the 2026 midterms.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. The benefits that tariffs are supposed to produce are reshoring and increase in manufacturing jobs, right? And theoretically, that should happen. But the timeline for that is much further out than the pain that is coming, right? And so politically, I think it's tough. That's why it's been kind of like this one-way process, why it's so difficult to establish protection, because you have to take the pain and then wait 3 to 5 years for companies to decide that the tariffs are not going away. We need to make these investment decisions, right? We're going to reopen these factories. We're going to spend the hundreds of millions or billions of dollars required to do that. We're going to find the workers, hire them, train them, start producing stuff at a higher cost than you can do it in Malaysia or Indonesia or whatever, right? But I think companies are looking at this, executives are looking at this, and they're just like, is this actually going to stay the way that it is? They're asking all the same questions you guys are asking. Like politically, this seems like box office poison, right?
Yes.
Doesn't seem like a big winner. So to whatever extent you think the United States will continue to have elections going forward, and it seems likely that we will, although that's an entirely different conversation, right? You're looking at that and you're like, I'm not going to make any investment decisions. There's too much uncertainty. Plus, we're dealing with this guy who just willy-nilly establishes the largest tariffs in a generation, including on Penguin Islands, pretty much overnight. Like, why wouldn't he just reverse himself for no reason? Then we're hung out to dry with these hundreds of millions or billions of dollars of investments that no longer make sense.
Well,
Like,
and the thing about this that I'm struggling to understand, and it might just be that there isn't anything to understand, but like Ryan told us last time, if that was really your goal, was to reshore jobs and revive manufacturing,
subsidies.
like,
Yes.
yeah, like this would not be the way to do that. And then the second piece is, I think we tend to admire political leaders that take hits politically, do things that are unpopular if they are in the interest of the country. What's interesting about this case is he's doing something that's probably going to be pretty unpopular politically, but does not appear to be good for the country. And that's a puzzle I am struggling to understand. I mean, I guess I was less surprised by the 2017 tax cuts because it was in keeping with what the Republicans had done for many years, which was cutting taxes for the wealthiest Americans. That one I struggled less. This one I'm having a harder time making sense of.
So let me ask you guys this. it seems to be the case, and Ryan, you know way more about this than I do, that the executive can unilaterally hand out, I guess, exemptions to trade barriers. Is that true?
Correct. Yes, you can petition the Commerce Department and ask for a waiver. The Trump administration originally said that they were not going to be giving waivers like they did in his first administration,
Okay.
because I believe I heard the quote that it was too much bureaucracy. It was way too much. But a lot of companies, that's how the political system works. You try to get some relief from these things that may have a bigger goal, but they're hurting a really small segment of the population. Right. This is what happens with agriculture. Agriculture gets a huge bailout from the Trump administration because the US-China trade war, which Trump thought was a much bigger thing for the US economy, he needed to help out those who were hurt by it.
Hmm.
And so it used to be the case that yes, you could petition commerce and then you would get maybe the tariff wouldn't hit you. That's not the case this time. They have explicitly stated that that's not going to happen.
Interesting.
And I think this also gets to, it gets to the issue that Steve was talking about with uncertainty, which is I don't have an MBA, but I'm pretty sure businesses really don't like uncertainty. They want to know if I'm going to invest that I'm going to have some money coming back for either my stockholders or if you're a small business or your family business in the future if you make that investment. When there's uncertainty, nobody's investing. All right. So you have these tariffs, which is increasing uncertainty in domestic and international financial markets. And there's no investment coming from the government because we're not sure if they're going to repeal the CHIPS Act. A lot of that money or the IRA has a lot of funding going to businesses. And so why would a company, even if they're thinking about reshoring, and maybe they've had plans to reshore for the last 5-10 years, why would they do it now? They don't know what the economy is going to look like in the US. So there's not going to be investment for that reason.
Hmm.
I want to go back to another thing that you guys had said, both of you in different ways. So Steve, you were talking about the tariffs on Penguin Islands, right? And
Right.
how ludicrous this is. Galen, you were also earlier talking about how our country's going to be looking elsewhere to trade if it costs so much to trade here. Or maybe you're also saying, are they going to look elsewhere to find partners who are willing to negotiate with them and not have to deal with the Trump administration? So one thing I think they're doing by putting the tariffs on the herd in McDonald Islands is they know that there's going to be trade diversion. We talked about this last time. When the tariffs went on China, we saw a lot of things shifting from China to Vietnam. And so we have a lot of things coming from Vietnam that used to be coming from China. This is, again, a bilateral trade issue. Nothing happened with our overall trade deficit. All it did was shift from China to Vietnam. And so one of the arguments for what they're doing is they're trying to make sure that we don't have this shifting of trade. Now, are we going to see developing factories on these islands with penguins? No. But I think it gives them a little bit of cover to say we're trying to make sure that we don't see this trade diversion. But then it also asks the question, why not on Russia? I know we have other agreements or other sanctions on Russia, but you could see the case now, plausible case, where some of these things are going through Russia if they don't have this baseline tariff that other countries have. So I think that's one reason why they did this. But I think that going back to strategically, what could happen is you're going to see other countries coming together without the US. The US, since Second World War, has been involved in writing the rules of the international economic and political order. Now, for the first time, we're seeing China team up with Japan and South Korea to jointly figure out ways to deal with these tariffs. If you're listening to this, you can't see my face, but my head is exploding. We've pushed it so that our main allies in the Pacific are now teaming up with China to figure out how to deal with this. We've seen this happen before with the pivot to Asia under the Obama administration. We saw the Obama administration trying to corner China and get them to deal better with the economic order that we think is best, right? We're trying to get them to change their trading practices. Ultimately, what Trump's trying to do, but just in a more collective manner, right? This is why we started negotiating the TPP for that goal. What we saw during that time period is the U.S., in particular the U.S. Congress, was not willing to bring China fully into this international order. And we saw that with the IMF. China wanted a bigger seat at the table at the International Monetary Fund. The U.S. Congress was not willing to do that. And so even though China had a huge economy, they didn't have very strong voting power in the IMF. So what did they do? They started their own international development bank. Now, the Obama administration was hoping that our allies would not join in, but almost every single ally did, including the UK. And this happened, I think it was when the UK prime minister was visiting with Obama. So it wasn't not a very good photo op. And so the US has tried to do this before, but tried to encircle China, tried to get the international order changed in a way that we can bring China in, but also keep them under wraps, make sure they don't get too powerful, make sure the US is still the global hegemon. It didn't work with Obama, not for lack of trying. What Trump's trying to do is actually pushing countries to do this even faster, right? So now we have Japan and South Korea working with China, trying to figure out how to deal with this. I won't be surprised if even with the history between Vietnam and China, historically, I won't be surprised if we see Vietnam joining this and other Southeast Asian countries.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Not for the United States. It doesn't make any sense for the United States. I wanted to actually double tap or drill down into what's going on with China specifically, because I think this is the single most important thing that has happened. Now, Trump started his second administration by kicking China in the kneecaps with, I think, an immediate 10 or 20%. There was like a series of escalating steps where it was, I think, 10% and then another 10% on top of that to China. And now
Correct.
a 34% on top of that. So they're up to, I think, cumulatively 54%. Where it's just like
actually
additive.
On average, it's about 70% now. As of
okay, we're up to 70%. Right. This is the single biggest and most important importing relationship that we have as the United States. And
I think importing of final goods, yes, but I think our importing from Mexico is way more important because that's a lot of unfinished intermediate goods that we use to produce things.
That's true. So I'm thinking now of all the cheap plastic crap that we absolutely rely on every single day of our lives, that we get from Amazon, that we get from Shein, that we get from Temu, this
and ultimately ends up in the Pacific Ocean.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
And one could look at that and make the argument, I think quite reasonably, this is not good for us or the environment, but we're quite dependent on it. And the first thing I thought when I started, coming to grips with what had happened was all of that shit's going to disappear more or less from the United States because it cannot be sent here profitably anymore. And that's going to have an extremely immediate impact, and not just cheap stuff too. Also a lot of electronics, the iPhone. This hits close to home because Nintendo is no longer selling the Switch 2 in the United States. This is a big deal, guys, for somebody who likes video games like me. My kid's going to be quite upset. So screw you very much.
I'm gonna have to defer to you, man. I think the last time I played video game was Mario Kart circa 2005. So
yeah, well, I used to work in games, and anyway, that's just that's a nasty one. And this is the single most okay, you said Mexico, true, right? But globally, when we're talking about the number one and number two economies, or the number two and number one, as the case may be, right? It's this relationship that everybody has been watching, and Trump like didn't rip the Band-Aid so much as he pressed like the Wile E. Coyote dynamite plunger here, right? And we were also talking about like playing ball versus retaliating. The Chinese have retaliated, and Trump
Right
has now
away.
escalated. Yeah, today, sometime today, we're recording this on what is today? The 8th. Sometime today, he has threatened an additional 50% on top of the 70 whatever percent. So taking us over
Mhm.
100%, right?
Correct.
Which would
We make it
render,
to 130% soon.
yeah, and that would render trade more or less non-viable, I think, for the vast majority of the stuff coming to us from China.
Correct. Yes, we have a very strong trading relationship, because we import a lot of goods from China. Walmart, the Waltons, going to be hit very hard. Most retailers are going to be hit quite hard. Temu, the likelihood of you being able to import things from Temu, that's dropped, because they also got rid of I believe it's called the de minimis tariff, which is on
Yes.
small packages. That is now gone. So you will have a tariff that's going to be imposed on small packages coming from abroad. That used to not happen before. And so that's going to be a major issue. Also a major bureaucratic issue to figure out how to do all these things. Yeah, I think it's going to hit consumers quite hard. It's going to hit China as well. China is going to, have a surplus of things that they've been producing. And what that's going to do is they're going to export those goods elsewhere. And that's going to hurt our allies. Our allies are going to be pissed, right? We don't live in a vacuum. We live in an international system. And so what you're going to see is all these things are going to be dumped in other foreign markets. By dumping, I mean, it's going to be below the price that's offered in those markets.
Just get rid of the inventory, right? Just get rid of the inventory.
Just get rid of the inventory. And so
Yeah.
that's going to hurt a lot of other countries. And if they're being hurt, why again are they going to want to try to negotiate with the Trump administration, who is inflicting pain on them and on their constituent, right? Again, politically, not going to be beneficial for them. Beneficial is going to be fighting back and fighting back hard, right? We saw prior to these tariffs, in Canada, the Conservative Party was doing quite well. They were predicted to win in the next election. Tariffs hit Canada. All of a sudden, the Conservatives decrease. The Liberals do much better.
By
Justin
like
Trudeau
30
steps
points
down.
or something like
It's a
that. Yeah.
major, if you look, it's a complete reversal.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Trudeau steps down. Mark Carney comes in, and you see that he is most likely going to win in the next election.
Yep.
A month and a half ago, we would have thought it was going to be the Conservatives, right? So Trump is having an impact, and it's because the Liberals came out and fought back hard. Countries that don't retaliate, don't fight back, their incumbents are going to lose. And so it looks like most countries will fight back. The point about having these cheap, mostly plastic products coming from China, this could actually be one, silver lining, is this could be good for the environment. Right? But let's assume that these are things that we need, that the demand is still going to be high for these goods.
Toys.
So toys.
Yeah. People
Come
with small
Christmas time.
children. Ask me how I know that.
If we're going to reshore that, and this is something that Howard Lutnick's been talking about, reshoring some of these things that used to be produced here, but now are produced abroad. In order to make it affordable, you have to have cheap inputs. All right. So plastic is going to be cheap because we produce a lot of oil. So we're fine there. Labor is not cheap in the US.
No.
Not cheap by any means. You could try to push down wages. Politically, it's not going to be helpful. What you'll end up seeing is robotics. You see that these things are going to be automated. This happened in Germany in the last decade. Adidas, a famous German company, didn't want to produce its shoes in East Asia or Southeast Asia anymore. So they brought manufacturing back to Germany. This is a huge announcement. Guess how many people unemployed? Actually, I don't know the numbers, but they basically automated the entire thing, right?
Yeah.
This is not, having people working in a specialized line. So if those things come back to the US, and they might, it's all going to be automated. And so, yes, there's going to be jobs in engineering, or highly, skilled jobs, and how to work with these tools. But it's not going to be in the blue collar jobs that Trump and Howard Lutnick think they're going to be bringing back. And so I don't see how this is good in the long term for manufacturing in the US.
I mean, this might be, I guess I'll be curious to hear your reaction, but listening to you two both talk about this, and especially Ryan talking about the need for cooperation internationally on some of these issues, like I'm reminded of Trump's withdrawal from the Iran nuclear deal. You
Hmm.
know, what a disaster, right? He withdrew from it in, I think, May 2018. Not
Mhm.
gonna go into the details of the negotiation, but it was a multilateral effort. You know, you had cooperation from even China and Russia on it. It was a very complex agreement. And then he tore it up saying, you know, we want to get a new deal. And the Iranians said no. And then the reaction was, oh, so what do we do now? And here we are, and Iran is closer to having a nuclear weapon than ever. There's exactly zero buy-in from the rest of the world. So, you know, now we're faced with the Iran gets the bomb or military action, which is to say a much worse position of leverage than existed prior to withdrawing. Is that sort of how you see this, Ryan? That if if
100%.
so a future, you know, whether it's after Trump or later in this term, if he does a U-turn, realizes, hey, we're not in as good a position. If he wants to renegotiate some of these treaties, the US might have worse terms than it did prior to withdrawing from these agreements and raising tariffs.
Yeah. I mean, again, going back to the US China trade war in 2018, same thing. The phase one deal really didn't do a whole lot that we didn't already have. It said that China was going to purchase a certain amount of goods from the US, again, without any sort of mechanism to enforce it if they didn't. And they never did. They never met their requirements under that deal. So we basically got nothing except I think it was like 26 billion that taxpayers paid to farmers to help them deal with the losses. With the JCPOA, the other unintended consequences of that is that it led to Europe figuring out ways to work around the US. All right. So the Europeans, they helped negotiate this just as much as the US did. You know, we were all together in putting these massive sanctions on Iran. The US dollar being a global reserve currency, we could use that power to stop money flowing into Iran. It hurts their economy massively. And so they basically had to come to the table and figure out some sort of negotiating. So they had to negotiate on something to make sure that there wasn't mass riots against the regime. And it worked. The Europeans were quite pissed when the US unilaterally pulled out of this agreement, and they wanted to show Iran that they were going to abide by it. And so they got around it by starting their own international way of a payment system. So to get around the SWIFT system, even though it's based in Belgium, they needed to find a way to get money to Iran, and they did. They needed to find out when the US basically tore up the WTO with the appellate body. The Europeans needed to find a way to still be able to bring cases to the WTO and get rulings on it so that if a country like China is doing something that goes against the rules, they can retaliate. The US stopped that first under Obama, then continuing with Trump, and it still hasn't been fixed even under Biden. Found a way to have a secondary type of dispute settlement body. And so the Europeans have basically tried to figure out ways to do things without the US. And none of this has been good for the US. And also, I would say, has been good for the Europeans, right? They have to figure out how these.
It's been good for nobody.
It's been good for absolutely nobody.
This is what you call a dead weight loss, right?
Yeah. And I think in a lot of cases, this will be. We saw it in the last weeks, trillions of dollars lost in the financial system.
Yes.
Basically, the last year, anything that grew, any growth in the US is gone, right? We lost basically a year of production in 3 days, right? We're basically, 4 working days now, but we lost almost a year of production, a year of value that was created. It's now gone because of this. And so, yeah, I think this is a dead weight loss, because what are we going to get for it?
So, yeah,
Not clear.
you talked about this a little bit. Last topic, because we don't have too much more time left, and this one's a doozy, right? You mentioned, and we talked about this last show. The dollar is the global reserve currency. I have read some arguments that this type of action actually puts that at risk for a couple different reasons. One reason is that the United States stood at the center of the global trading system. You needed dollars to transact with the United States. If the United States removes itself from that position, you don't need dollars as much, right? It's not as
Yep.
important. Number one. Number two, people need dollars to buy US Treasury debt in a
Mhm.
crisis, which was classically the safe haven of last resort, right?
Mhm.
And if the United States can no longer be trusted due to political risk or whatever you want to call it, right? Maybe treasuries aren't necessarily the best investment anymore in a crisis. Maybe it's gold, maybe it's Swiss francs, maybe it's a basket of like the yen, the yuan, the euro, and sterling, right? And we're actually seeing during this self-imposed crisis some movements in that direction. Is my understanding is like people are still buying treasuries and the yields are coming down, which was one of Trump's policy goals, right? He wanted to bring the yields down, force the interest rates down, and then force the Fed through recessionary action to bring those rates down as well. The Fed's stuck in a no-win situation because basically bringing the rates down will fire up inflation again, which we're going to get
Yep.
anyway, right? So it's damned if you do, damned if you don't. We could end up in a stagflationary situation very easily. But I want your comment, Ryan, on whether you think this affects the dollar's position as a global reserve currency. And if it does, what kind of risk is that?
It's a great question. I this one I'm less inclined to make strong predictions on. I
Mhm.
do think at the margins, like you said, we're gonna see some shifts. We saw that when the US has been using the dollar as its strongest way of imposing sanctions on
Right.
countries.
Weaponization of the
So
dollar.
weaponization of the dollar started really strongly with Bush, but really picked up with Obama, mostly at Russia for the
Mhm.
things that they were engaging in. But with the JCPOA, this was the main use of sanctions was through the U.S. dollar, and we see these countries that are hit with this move away from the dollar. Right, so Russia's not really dependent on the U.S. dollar at all anymore. China has been slowly moving away from holding a lot of US dollars as well. But are we going to see a massive change where central banks aren't really, holding US dollars? I don't think that's going to happen. What could happen, my big worry. So on Friday, I'm going to talk with a bunch of people about the book I'm working on, which
Mm.
was called Currency Wars in Retreat. Because we saw over the last decade and a half that these wars between currencies were actually beginning to subside. And it was because
Mm.
of this international economic system that we have of these global
Mm.
value chains that undercut the benefits, political and economic, of engaging in currency manipulation. My
Ryan,
prediction,
did the president blow up your book?
the president made it more popular than it needed to be because it's no longer currency wars in retreat. It's just currency war. Because all signs point to the president trying to devalue the US dollar, but not doing it
Ah,
through
okay.
cooperation, but doing it through coercion. And that's going to set off a massive currency war. Even these tariffs, I think, are going to set off a currency war where the only tool that countries have to fight back against the US is to devalue their exchange rate. We
Mm.
import a lot from China. China does not import a lot from the US. And so it can hit certain products, certain goods, but there's not a lot that it can really hit. And so the best way to fight back is to put a blanket tariff on everything, which is by devaluing your exchange rate. That
Mhm.
I think is the major concern about my major concern for the US dollar is that we begin to engage in this sort of currency war. And if that happens, then I believe there's less certainty in the US. The US dollar as the main vehicle currency to engage in transactions begins to lessen. Maybe more reliance on the euro or even the Chinese have done a really good job of forcing its major trading partners of using the yuan to transact. They used to be 80% of trade was done in US dollars. For China, it's almost half of their trade with their major partners is done in the yuan. That's huge. So I think that's going to be the kind of, if we begin to see those shifts where more things are being transacted in these other currencies, then I think there's some worry that the US is losing its power. But I think the biggest worry domestically is what's going to happen with the Fed. So the Fed has a dual mandate to fight inflation, but also to keep unemployment low. When there's stagflation, high unemployment, high inflation, they're kind of at a crossroads. They have to, in a way,
Choose one.
Choose one. What are they going to deal with first? The issue I have with Trump is Trump's been kind of trying to put his finger on the scale and trying to get the Fed to do something that he wants. If the Fed makes it look like they're doing something that he wants, they lose their credibility and independence. And they're very well aware of that. And so they may not do something that needs to be done just because they don't want to look like they're doing something to appease the president. And that can have impacts on the US economy. I think they probably fight the unemployment issue first and see what happens to inflation. But we know from the 1970s, early 1980s, as inflation goes up and up, they have to step in and they have to bring unemployment sky high and an interest rate sky high in order to fight that and bring it back down. And so the Fed's really at like a no-win scenario with the Trump tariffs. And I think they realize that, and they're already starting to try to tell the markets how they're thinking about this. You don't always see Jerome Powell come out and say, yeah, we're watching what the administration is doing with tariffs and blah, 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 blah. That doesn't happen. But they're trying to guide the markets as to how they're thinking about this. And I think they're not in a good place.
Just a couple quick points since we're almost out of time. Ryan and Steve were talking about weaponizing the dollar and things like secondary sanctions.
Right.
People that are interested. There's a good book called The Underground Empire by, I think it's Farrell and Newman, that does kind of a good job of bringing that stuff down to earth. And the second thing listening to this that occurs to me is, people have been talking about the potential for a Cold War 2.0 between the United States and China for kind of decades now. And it always struck me as an imperfect analogy for a number of reasons. One being that during the Cold War, we had kind of two closed trading blocks. I mean, they were sort of relatively open within each block, but not across blocks. Whereas until several days ago, we had a fairly open international economic system globally. Now I don't know what to make of it if this continues with kind of an open international system, except for the United States. So that's going to mean a lot more analysis on what this Cold War 2.0, if that's what we want to call it, looks like.
Yeah. Well, maybe Mercosur takes over North America, right? It moves north.
Well, do you mind if I end on that Cold War point? So in the Cold War, the US had clearly strong hard power, but also really strong soft power. One of my favorite movies from the era is Goodbye Lenin. Right, when you have the signs of capitalism.
It is a good movie. Yeah.
In West Berlin, the US soft power has been declining since Trump has come into office. And it is really, I think, hitting rock bottom with these tariffs. You already had Canada saying that they're not going to be buying American goods. I think this is going to happen across the world where they're just not going to want to buy US goods or potentially even US services. And so if this is a type of Cold War, our hard power is still strong, but our soft power has been declining. I think it's a major, major issue.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And, I think I'll close on this idea. Ryan, you're worried about competitive devaluations in a high tariff environment. That sounds like the 1930s.
100%.
Like classically, that's what ended up happening. You had these bigger thy neighbor policies where it was just this circle of like tit for tat actions, where basically you ended up in a series of competitive autarkies, and then the fighting started.
Yep.
So that's something to watch out for too.
My advisor wrote a famous paper in 1987, APSR, Ron Rogowski, about how these major shocks could lead to major shifts in political power. And he talked about how this trade shock in the 1930s in Europe led to the rise of fascism in Italy and Germany. And so I think we might see, again, major political shifts because of these major trade shocks.
Yeah. Shout out Professor Rogowski. Love it. Go
Yeah,
Bruins.
as I seem to recall, inflation was part of that story as well. So
There you go.
Yep.
Yeah, these things
Yep.
tend to travel together. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks again to Ryan for joining us.
Yeah.
And thanks for
for
doing
having me.
an early morning emergency session. This has been Global Tantrum.